50 days after the first case. And again, a similar kind of exchange of susceptibles. Not quite as many people are infected, but majority are. All right, so those are the cases without intervention. So let me just sum up. All right, so we would see the first death about 115 days after the first symptomatic case in the worst case scenario, with eventually 63 deaths, or we would see the first death 150 days after the first diagnosis, eventually leading to 58 deaths. Right, so that's kind of the do nothing case. If we halve the contacts, right, then the worst case scenario, you see quite a big reduction here, right? So we've reduced from 10 to the 4 to 10 to the 2, and the first death appears much, much later. It's like 450 days later, right? So in the graph, you see that the peak is now 700 individuals rather than 6,000. So that's great. The number of deaths long-term would be 25. That's a significant improvement. And remember, this is the worst case scenario with half the contacts. But I think the other thing to note from here is that many people do not get infected, right? The blue susceptible curve, it doesn't even go to halfway down, right? So that means a lot of people are not getting infected in the first place. All right, so what about the best case scenario with 50% contact reduction? And here we see, well, now we're kind of talking 10 to the 1 cases, and the first death is appearing kind of about, it's 1850 days after the first case on campus. So that's quite a long time. So here we're talking 25 cases overall, the first death appearing 1850 days later, and 5 dead individuals overall. If you look at the blue susceptible curve, you see that most people are uninfected, right? The infection basically doesn't come through if you halve the contacts. Now, we did significantly more than that, so in truth. So this is kind of what we're probably looking at, right? I'll also put up the Ottawa numbers in a bit. I will just say, though, this is a very long time scale, right? This is in days, and we're talking 5,000 days is many, many days. So in practice, we would have probably have to refine our model because there would be lots of changes. So I'll talk about that towards the end. Okay, so just to sum up, if we have high transmission, then the first death occurs 450 days after diagnosis, leading to 25 deaths. If we have low transmission, the first death occurs 1850 days after the first diagnosis, leading to 5 deaths. And what we see is reduction of contacts is very critical, right? It really changes things in all cases. All right, so what happened with this model, right? I gave it to the administration very late in the evening on March 12th. And so on March 13th, so one day after receiving them, or really as soon as they received it, what happened? They closed campus entirely, right? They said, no, we don't care about this 50%. We are closing this down to 0, or at least as close to 0 as they can. It remains closed, except for essential research. So for example, some labs that can't be left unattended. And summer 2020, which I've just finished teaching, fall 2020 and winter 2021 are all online, right? Including next winter. So we basically said we're guaranteeing everyone is online. That's in part to give some certainty to international students, so they can make plans accordingly. But also, I think it's not a bad idea, right? And I will certainly say now, having taught 1.5 courses online, I don't see the problem here. I don't know why other places are not doing this. I mean, some Canadian places are doing it by semester, and most of them are staying closed in the fall. But I think other places definitely should be closing down. I don't really see the point of keeping it open. And what we see from this is reduction of contacts really matters. And the university is a big mixing pot, right? There's lots of people moving around, having close contact with each other all the time. That's something that I think we can easily, take care of. All right, so what about since then, right? So since March 12th, well, more information has come to light, so we know some more things. Also, we very much changed our patterns of behavior due to global lockdown, right? So there've been no deaths on campus since, well, that's pretty much to be expected, except there actually has been a case on campus, right? In fact, there wasn't until I was preparing this talk. This was discovered on July 20th that there was a case in the support staff who was attending. It was one of the labs, I think. So they had to quarantine that person and also anyone who was working in the lab with them. So in a sense, you could think perhaps the clock has started, right? We've seen our first case on campus. Now, it's not under the same conditions as it was in March, but nevertheless, how long are we talking until the first death? I mean, one might hope that it never happens, but realistically, it may well, even with the reduction that we have, right? So it may take a long time, or we may just get unlucky. All right, so just to pull back a bit out of campus and talk about the city of Ottawa. Right, so Ottawa is the capital of Canada. It's a mid-sized city, and the infection has followed the typical age distribution. There were significant infections in hospitals, in retirement homes, and long-term care facilities, but not very many in the community. The lockdown happened, pretty quickly, pretty efficiently, and it's been pretty good. Here is the data. So this is the data as of last week or so, right? Let's get the mouse going here, right? So I think if you look at the graph here in black is the institutional outbreaks. So you can see we had quite intense outbreaks in institutions. The blue dashed curve, that's the sporadic outbreak. So that's sort of people bringing it in from elsewhere and so on. And the green, which is right at the bottom, that's the community outbreaks. So you can see there was some community outbreak, but very low numbers early on, and then not much else since. In terms of ongoing, the number of deaths has been very static at 263 for quite some time now. So that has not changed. Actually, I checked today and it's still 263. So the deaths is very flat. The number of cases is rising a little at the end, but well, who knows what is going to happen eventually. Of course, the latest data is always subject to revision. The age distribution is pretty much what you would expect, right? It doesn't really affect younger people that much, but it affects older people quite a bit. There's quite a gender disparity, which was a bit of a surprise to me. I don't know why it's so skewed, so 60-40. I'm sure there are all kinds of explanations we could figure out for those. So that's where we're at the moment. So functionally speaking, Ottawa's first wave has ended. Right? So we have a total of 244 cases, 263 deaths. That's out of a population of 1.4 million for a kind of mid-sized Canadian city. Sporadic cases peaked in mid to late March at 27 cases per day, and a much larger outbreak in long-term care facilities peaked at 93 cases per day in April. So the last thing I'm going to consider is what if we reopen campus, right, with appropriate caution? And so there's been some discussion about this. So for example, we have masks, we have partial remote learning, right? Now, one of the knock-on effects here is, of course, contacts with symptomatic people would be lower, both because we're being more careful and also because individuals would be isolating if they had symptoms. And this might offset their higher rate of viral shedding compared to asymptomatic individuals. So we could revise that, right? So for campus, we said, well, people are under 70, so let's use the lower death rate. We might do a similar idea for asymptomatic individuals, right? So younger people are less affected by the disease. So if they're going to be infected, they're probably infected in an asymptomatic way. So what we can do is we can have a ratio, say, well, the population death rate to population symptomatic rate, we could match the campus death rate, which we'd adjusted to the campus symptomatic rate, and say, well, that gives us a way of finding the campus symptomatic rate. And if we do this, we find that in that kind of like mid scenario where we had recovery happening twice as fast and transmission half as good, we would have 97% of people being asymptomatic, and the beta here would be like 10 times 10 to the minus 6. It would have to be much, much larger because only a very few individuals are doing most of the transmitting. And in this case, if we run the numbers as before, then what you can see is, yes, most people get infected, but the total number of cases peaks at 300. Right? That's quite a ways down from 6,000. This is the worst case scenario. And the number of dead individuals is 2, right? So that doesn't seem so bad. You can also see in the larger graph, you can't really see the red here because the red peak in the big graph has been replaced with the kind of light blue one for the asymptomatic individuals. So this is a disease largely driven by asymptomatic people on campus, right? So we've peaked at 300 instead of 6,000. The first death is predicted at a similar time, 127 days versus 115. Total deaths, though, is kept at very low numbers, and the other cases produce similar results. All right, so one of the long-term predictions we said was for 5,000 days, and I do want to stress, I'm not suggesting lockdown remain for 13 years. That would be quite intense. It's really up to political leaders, and I guess university leaders to decide how many deaths on campus might be acceptable. Right? Is it 2, 25, or 63? That may change under different circumstances. The actual reduction due to lockdown was almost certainly more than 50% among students, but it's probably heterogeneous. Right? For example, if students are essential workers, working in grocery stores and so on, and they may take on more of these jobs if they're not needing to be on campus. So they may end up having more contacts as a result. So that's certainly possible. Some of the limitations of this was it was a snapshot in time, right? The data was what we had on March 12th. The model does not consider vital dynamics, so no influx of new susceptibles, no deaths due to other reasons. It's probably going to remain true that there are no new susceptibles, but university policies have changed due to lockdown, right? And so who's coming to campus? That's a very good question, right? It's right now it's not too many people. That may change over time. For example, we might have fewer international students. I know I have a master's student who went back to Korea and is doing her master's from there, including TAing. She doesn't mind TAing at 3 a.m., so that's fine. Also an increase in distance learning. So lots of different things will change the makeup of the population. So we'd assumed mass action transmission for our transmission rate. This assumes individuals are well mixed. This assumption may not hold in future, right? So we've reduced the number of contacts, but also the strength of their interactions, so that you may have, fewer contacts, but you also may have some really intense contacts with a very few people. So if we were to update our model, we might change the nature of the transmission. We also assumed that recovered individuals were immune to reinfection, which was the thinking at the time. We now know that is not true. It's much more complicated than that. So that would probably need to be updated for the next step. All right, so in summary, some of the benefits of this model were its rapid development, its flexibility, considering multiple cases where data was lacking, the ability to directly answer questions posed by the university administration, especially in kind of a blind panic. So what we've seen is the role that models can play during a fast-moving pandemic. We've shown the power to make predictions and illustrated their ability to inform policy when linked to decision-making processes. So in conclusion, we've illustrated the interface between theoretical mathematics, numerical simulations, real-world data, and human behavior. By modeling the disease during the very early stages of a pandemic, we can see a variety of potential scenarios. They can be assessed quickly using the information that we had at the time, and decisions can then be made by the administration armed with useful predictions. Okay, so this has actually just been published in proceedings of the Symposium 2020 conference, which happened last week. So if you're interested, you can find that on my website. You're welcome to either click on the link or type the link, I guess, or look at the QR code. They take you to the same place. So I will say thank you very much. And I will come back for questions after the next 2 talks, I believe.
Thank you, Robert. So for the participants or audience, feel free to type in your questions in either the Zoom or YouTube chat box. We'll take the question and answer after the 3rd talk.